maximum time, to participate. So I see it as my task to help you to do that. But a couple of just quick reminiscences, observations. I was in Taiwan with Joe and a Canadian academic delegation in December at the invitation of the Information Office. We had a wonderful trip. It was at the point of Wen Jiabao's visit to Washington and the emergence of major tensions and frictions in the Taipei-Washington nexus. And my feeling at that point was that although much was made about the overriding preference of Taiwanese for the status quo, that in fact, sort of tweaking Washington's tail, would sell. And I was quite confident after leaving that, in fact, that the Greens would, in fact, win largely on that basis. I was intrigued by Joe's opening comments in which he said on election eve at a dinner party of the 9 participants of that dinner party, 6 predicted blue victory. He didn't identify his own position at that point. I just wondered, were you on the 6 or the 3? In so-called on the assassination, attempt, we sort of recently come across a piece sort of discussing what's now known as Bulletgate, that a forensic delegation from the United States is now, in Taiwan, sort of examining the details of this attempt, including the wound and the nature of the trajectories, headed by someone who was, in fact, presided over the Kennedy, assassination attempt. So we should shortly hear from them. Also, perhaps of interest to you is that members of the Florida Electoral Commission are also at work, assisting with the recount. That's not true. I thought I would sort of say a couple of words, sort of largely focusing on the Chinese and Chinese policy, which Bernie has, I think, dealt with very well. And I was going to sort of frame my remarks in terms of the Chinese rather formulaic sort of numerological tradition, the 8 basic points, 1 country, 2 systems, 1 central task, 2 basic whatever. You're familiar with this. And I would talk about 1 basic point, 5 underlying factors, and 2 issues for concern. But I'll do them very, very quickly. The 1 central point is I see no basis for the kind of alarmist speculation in the media. We're seeing, as I think most of the people have said, particularly with respect to cross-strait relations, really quite a moderate stance being adopted by all parties, and largely continuity, both in terms of, particularly in terms of Beijing's policy, a little less so in terms of Washington's, policy. What are the 5 underlying, factors? The first and foremost, I think one could point to in the past decade, the professionalization, the institutionalization of Taiwan policymaking in the PRC. Previously, much more volatile, highly politicized. The leading group for Taiwan Affairs, the Central Leading Group for Taiwan Affairs, is now quite professionally staffed, and their considerations are enmeshed in a broad range of wider considerations. So I think policy continuity is partially assured as a consequence, not likely to be disrupted by the sort of still kind of fragile succession arrangements that are emerging. So that the 16th Party Congress position on cross-strait relations, I think, is likely to persist. I think a second factor would be the overriding priority that's been accorded by almost all members of the Chinese senior political elite to economic development as a sort of core priority. There's something they're not likely to disturb. A third factor would be, their increasing degree of confidence in or reliance confident reliance on the U.S. role in managing Taiwan Straits relations. Previously, the United States was seen as the principal obstacle to a resolution. Now the U.S. is largely seen as the guarantor, of a stable relationship. That the U.S. will intervene to prevent any unilateral Taiwan declaration of independence in any form. And the Chinese have pursued a regional diplomacy in East Asia, which seems likely to kind of buttress that as well. I can't remember what number I'm on, but certainly the extraordinary kind of explosion and multiplication of economic links. So fundamentally, it seems to me that the PRC is confident that it has the support of Taiwan business elites, and can in a sense constrain Taiwan in that means. And finally, they know the DPP. It's the devil they've dealt with now for 5 years. Although they anticipated with some hope, a change, they're perfectly prepared to, I think, to go on and they're not particularly fearful of change. So what are the 2 points of kind of sort of focus or attention or concern? I think one to me is, something to watch for anyway, is the May 20th inauguration speech of Chen Shui-bian. We have his interview with BBC in which he said pledges continued sort of support for good relations across the Pacific. But in his previous inaugural address, he included the 5 no's as a reassurance to Beijing, ostensibly or allegedly at the insistence of the United States, which helped him to draft that portion of his inaugural speech. So I'm eager to see, what, and I think as we all are, to see what that will be. But another interesting kind of irony of the current situation is the importance of legal and constitutional issues. Neither of them, one would have said previously to be points of critical concern either for the KMT or the CCP, or in fact Hong Kong. But everything is now being framed in terms of referenda, constitutional reform, NPC's legislative oversight of the basic law in Hong Kong. And the key point with reference to Taiwan Straits is the discussion in the mainland of national reunification law. So if we ask him what will PRC do in the next sort of upcoming period, the discussion is that they will put into place within the next couple of years a national reunification law, which will set a firm timetable that will have the same effect, forcing effect as 1997 did, which will include the obligation to resolve it by force if necessary if certain targets are not met along the line. And so that the fact that they should have to resort to legislation to sort of to kind of ratchet this process forward is an interesting testimony to the paramountcy of kind of legal or quasi-legal approach. So anyway, I hope that was short enough. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Why don't we open it up to the floor for comments or questions? We'll take a group of them and then we'll address it.
On the suits that are coming forward, let me hypothesize that in the recount, DPP wins. The issue is nullification, and the conspiracy theorists turn out to be right, and somehow that becomes public. And there's been a case that more than 30,000 people have been prevented from voting, and it goes to the Supreme Court. I don't know a thing about the Supreme Court, and if that's even its name. But think about Florida 4 years ago. Think about the U.S. Supreme Court. Who appointed the people? Presumably the KMT appointed them. No, it didn't. Anyway, whoever appointed them. And could you imagine the Supreme Court making a decision nullifying the election. If as they hypothesize, and I have no reason to believe that my hypotheses are correct, but if there is a real case that nullification would be appropriate, the alternative, and just to complete that, is this a Canadian-like Supreme Court that might like an appeal to judicial activism and put and undoubtedly an argument will be made, a real test of democracy in Taiwan under this hypothesis would be the Supreme Court's nullifying the election, if there were genuine reasons to do so.
A somewhat related question. I'm a little puzzled by your optimism that the recount especially of invalid ballots, will be in the DPP favor. What are the nature of the invalidation of these ballots, and could you explain a little more about that?
First of all, thank you for Professor for giving us such a nice presentation. Secondly, I would like to talk about that. I agree with the observation that this year, this Taiwanese election has been defined by who loves Taiwan more. But I would like to point out that the so-called national identity redefine or construction, I think needs political power and social support. But because of this elections, its result has been distorted by the shooting incident. And it is very difficult for us to find out whether the DPP has again his social support or not, because the election has been, just you mentioned, distorted by the shooting incident. And we all know that in the past, the DPP is not very good at building a very effective coalitions. Its basic structure is to appeal to the public support by mobilizing the public with nationalist sentiment. My question is that in 2006, DPP has another task to finish, that is to make a new constitution and to push it through the political process of democratic politics in Taiwan, especially through the referendums. My question is that does DPP has enough power? I mean, in terms of the social support and political power, to put this new constitution, which has been defined by some Taiwanese nationalists as a very important step for the Taiwan to become a normal nation. Does the DPP has enough power or not to push through this new constitution? Because just as one professor you just mentioned here, in terms of the vote cast in the referendum, we can see that the vote cast in referendum is much more than the vote cast in support of President Chen Shui-bian. It seems to give us a message that in order to love Taiwan, you don't necessarily to love DPP. And it also gives us an impression that Taiwanese people may be more like Taiwan than like DPP. So I don't know if this kind of judgment is right or not.
Two more questions and then we'll
This is a really quick one. I read in one news story that there was an actual campaign encouraging people to invalidate votes. So it makes it much less obscure, the reasons. I haven't heard anyone mentioning that, so if you could comment.
This is really not related to the vote per se, but what happens now that there's a party in power and there's a legislature up for election in December, and in the papers when I was there is a pan-purple coalition that neither of you have spoken about, that is comprised of social groups, environmental activists, women's groups, migrant advocacy groups, and so on. And their position is they're going to continue to watch whoever's in power for a realization of the positions, when they ever were articulated throughout the election campaign, that policies that address these issues are in fact enacted, which is sort of points to something that Victor said about policy making, institutionalization, professionalization. I don't know if any of you can comment on that, maybe Joseph or Michael.
Okay. On the question of the courts, first of all, it's not the Supreme Court. It'd be the equivalent of the Provincial Court of Appeal. It's the higher court. And each county has a as a Galdong in a higher court. And I think the actual case, they ended up fighting it in the Tainan, in the Tainan High Court, and the judges which will handle this are actually going to be chosen at random by a computer spitting out which name the judges are. Most of the judges in Taiwan have worked their way up, and of course were appointed in the KMT era. And of course, in the old days, the KMT, of course, told the judges what to do, and that was that. And many of the judges have had to work very hard to show that, you know, as far as we're concerned, those days are over too. And so the courts will work very hard to show that they're impartial and fair in dealing with this. There's no way they're going to invalidate the election simply because the basis for invalidating the election in the election law, which I have here somewhere, is too narrow to for them to make an adjudication on that. So that was why, in fact, the government agreed to a recount and said to have a recount, first of all, we have to have an amendment to the election law in the legislature, which they agreed to fast track, which would allow for a total recount when there was such a narrow margin of victory. And first the KMT said that was fine, and they said, no, we don't want that. We want an amendment which would retroactively cancel invalidate the whole election. And then they said, no, they didn't want anything at all. They wanted the president to declare a state of emergency, i.e. martial law, and then deal with it all through presidential fiat. So this goes back to nobody really knew what they wanted until Ma Ying-jeou made that speech on Sunday afternoon. On the invalid ballots, the high proportion of invalid ballots can be attributed to three factors. The first was at the end of October, the Central Election Commission, and I'm not quite sure what the story behind this is, but I've read that it was actually, they were within the legislative justice committee that the KMT candidates were asking for this as a way they thought would cut out some DPP voters, because a lot of DPP voters tend to be rural and less educated. As you see in this model ballot, where's that other piece? There's a picture. There's a picture and a number, and then the space where you put your chop in the space provided. And in fact, because of the past KMT history of ballot box stuffing, now they actually have an official chop in the little ballot box, which you have to use. You can't just mark it with a pencil, and that is because in the old days, with vote buying, in fact, remember these polls are often very small, especially in rural areas. You're talking about a few hundred people. You'd be told, okay, you make a little circle here, or you mark your X on the picture, and then you know, we won't pay you until we know that you voted the way you were told. And because the votes are actually passed around and everybody looks at them, the person from the party knows, oh, okay, here's the little circle at the end. Okay, you know, Lao Wang voted the way, he gets his 1,000 kwai. That's why they have these chops. On October 29th, the Executive Yuan revised the regulations to say that whereas in the past, as long as there was a clear indication of voter preference, in other words, a chop on the face, a chop on the name, a chop on the number, they would be accepted. From now on, only a chop in the space where you're supposed to put your chop will be accepted. The Election Commission, nobody had any problems with that, although after the election, then people said, well, the Election Commission should have done more of an education campaign about this. In fact, at every polling place in Taiwan, there's a large big poster which shows all the various legal ways of chopping your ballot, and also all the ones that will not be accepted. And clearly they should have done more to educate people, because people in rural areas, probably for years, they've been chopping on the face of the candidate, and they just, old habits die hard. The problem is, of course, this campaign, which I don't think affected more than a few 10,000 votes, probably, to put your chop on the mouth of the lying politicians to invalidate your ballot, specifically saying chop on their mouth to invalidate your ballot, complicates the fact of how you're going to read these. You can't then say, oh, well, we'll go back to the old rules, and as long as it's a chop on the face of the politician, we'll count it for that politician, because now you had a group specifically saying, invalidate your ballot by chopping on the face. So for that reason, you had a high number of invalid ballots. The other thing was that I suspect that some people who were, again, rural people who were supporting the Blues, they got the message, okay, you're to not to vote for the referendum. Probably some of them got the message mixed up and figured, well, you're supposed to invalidate your vote for the election too. And I would draw some support for this from the fact that the rate of invalid voting was much lower in Taipei and Kaohsiung, the metropolitan areas, than it was in Taiwan province. And as I pointed out, the highest rate of invalid voting of all was in Jinmen and Matsu, where you had 3.5%. So the Blues are going to make a big thing about these invalid votes. The courts are going to say, listen, those are the regulations, everybody agreed on them, they were publicized, we can't go back and redo this again. So that's why I can confidently say that a recount is not going to change the outcome. It will change the outcome by a few hundred votes, because there's always some human error. But the vote counting in Taiwan is extremely rigorous. And in fact, all of the reasons that the Blues have listed for saying, we want to recount, are basically trivial matters of human error, which are only being listed because they were discovered by the Election Commission and corrected at the time. And for instance, the case of somebody who, for whatever reason, perhaps by mistake, took one envelope of votes home after the election. It was as soon as they did the count, they found out, hey, there's an envelope missing, and they immediately sent the police to his house to get the envelope back. So even the cases of questions are basically a human error, all of which were caught by the Election Commission, because it takes its job very seriously.
If I could just answer very briefly the question about Ann Kirkland and also about the DPP. I think that the social movement groups, civic groups, will play a much larger role in legislative elections. They typically do, primarily because legislators, particularly in the absence of any electoral reform, legislators have an incentive to appeal to these groups. And in many ways, they've been able to set the policy agenda from the bottom up this way. Less so in terms of presidential elections. But I do think that they will play a considerable role in the December legislative election. With respect to the question of identity in Taiwan, I think as many people have pointed out, the elections themselves are a love fest. I think that both the Kuomintang and the DPP have in many ways, in fact in almost all ways, converged on very fundamental issues and values surrounding the sovereignty question in Taiwan. So in that regard, I don't know that there's as much discord. And the point I was trying to make is that, in fact, there's very little or less polarization than we might think with respect to issues of national identity. The question then is, will Chen Shui-bian himself, as the president, be able to mobilize enough support? Again, I think I want to stress the last point that I made, and that is that President Chen has to, first of all, I think, win back the trust of many people, particularly some voters who are now quite aware of the fact that the referendum was used to mobilize the green base. This isn't controversial in the minds of many people. And also, I think he has to be extremely forthright and clear. It has to be much more transparent about his intentions. Again, I think the question of what does Chen Shui-bian really think has to emerge quite quickly. And the only way in which we might see some distortion is in how they play the legislative elections in December. But shortly thereafter, I think some position has to come out quite clearly. Yep, sure.
Just 2 points. On the Supreme Court, I don't know that, I confess that I haven't got it completely straight, but I understand that one of the courts, maybe that court, the key court that's supposed to pass on part of this current questioning of the process of the recount and so forth, that last year, all those judges in that court were replaced by Chanchuilian. So they're all now DPP supporters. Whatever that means in terms of the fairness or not, or supporting DPP position, we don't know. But to that question, it reminds one, of course, of Florida, you know, and the struggle in the United States always to get its, the party empowers people on the court. Whether it will make a difference or not, or whether that's the court, remains to be seen. On the pan-purple and the 330,000 invalid ballots, my understanding was that the pan-purple, or people in that group of NGOs and who represented the poor in Taiwan, and those social groups, they wanted their supporters to boycott the election and to invalidate ballots. So there's some question just how many of those ballots, of the 337, were deliberately invalidated by these groups and are not necessarily part of some big plot, but in fact this was a deliberate thing, and who knows? So that's just to add to that.
Other questions?
I just want to make a couple of comments. It has been a long time since I attended this kind of meeting, since I left UoT. I find it interesting to hear this kind of academic seminar. The second thing I want to say is I find this election, let me use two words. One is soap opera. The second is contrary to what Michael said. It is about who loves Taiwan. I think from what the poster you see here, it is just a way to show who hates who, because you are trying to portray that if you vote this, you are love Taiwan. If you vote the other, you don't love Taiwan. And I hope, the last comment is, I hope this is not a coincidence. And if it is not, I really want to congratulate you for selecting today to have this seminar. As you know, today is the first day of April.
I'm wondering, after the election, when it's so close, I was figuring, well, that gives nobody a mandate for strong change. Is that true, though? Does it really matter? If it gives Chen a leg up in the legislative elections, then in fact it gives him a stronger hand for change. So I don't know what your view is on that.
Well, actually, Michael, you just have one more question.
I think I would agree with most of the